68,900 people. That is the number of names entered into Venezuela's missing persons database as of Saturday morning, June 28th. Not 68,000 approximate estimates, not a figure rounded for the news cycle. 68,900 individual reports filed by families who last saw someone on Wednesday evening and have not heard from them since. The confirmed death toll is 1,430. That number is what officials can verify. It is the number of bodies identified at hospitals. It is not the number under the rubble. It is not the number inside the buildings that pancaked in La Guaira. It is not the number from the coastal towers of Catia La Mar, where 200 housing blocks stand, and where, according to rescue workers on the ground, the stench of decomposition had already spread by Saturday afternoon. The gap between 1,430 and 68,900 is not a data discrepancy. It is the distance between what governments can confirm and what satellites can see. Here is what the satellites saw. Researchers at Oregon State University's Conflict Ecology Lab processed Copernicus Sentinel-1 radar imagery taken before and after June 24th. Sentinel-1 is a European Space Agency satellite system that uses synthetic aperture radar to detect changes in the Earth's surface, changes that are invisible to the human eye but register clearly in the data as structural alteration or collapse. The analysis estimated that approximately 58,870 buildings were likely damaged or destroyed by the twin earthquakes across Venezuela's northern coastal corridor. 58,870 buildings. To understand what that number means at human scale, consider this. The average Venezuelan household contains 3.5 people. If even 10% of those damaged structures were fully collapsed and occupied, the number of people directly in harm's way exceeds 20,000. The UN's International Organization for Migration estimated that up to 6.76 million people have been affected by this disaster, 2 million of them in Caracas alone. That is roughly the population of Los Angeles. But the satellite images reveal something beyond the raw count of destroyed structures. They reveal a geography of destruction that the news cameras have not fully reached. The city of Macuto sits on Venezuela's northern coast, roughly 30 kilometers from Caracas. Planet Labs and Vantor satellite imagery shows the city before and after, compact blocks of mid-rise apartment buildings facing the Caribbean, streets running perpendicular to the beach. After June 24th, sections of Macuto simply ceased to exist as built environment. The before image shows rooftops. The after image shows exposed ground where rooftops used to be, and debris fields extending into what were previously streets. Caraballeda, a few kilometers east, tells a similar story. Residential towers that were standing as recently as December 2025, visible in pre-earthquake imagery, are gone, not damaged, gone. The satellite shows the footprint of their foundations and the debris cone that spreads outward from where the structure used to stand. There is a third location the cameras have barely reached, Caracas itself. The capital is 280 kilometers from the epicenter, far enough that most international coverage focused on La Guaira as the primary disaster zone. But Caracas has 3 million residents. Satellite radar data shows significant structural change signatures across multiple districts of the city, including Altamira, Chacao, and Catia. These are not the dramatic pancake collapses of coastal towers. They are the subtler signatures of buildings that cracked but did not fall. Structures that look intact from the street but have compromised load-bearing walls, shifted foundations, and internal damage that will only become apparent weeks from now when a stairwell gives way or a ceiling panel drops on a family that thought they survived. This is what satellite imagery does that ground-level footage cannot. It removes the emotional noise and shows you the arithmetic. Building was here. Building is not here. Multiply that across 58,870 structures, and you begin to understand why 68,900 families have filed missing persons reports, and why rescue workers on the ground say the true death toll will take months to determine. By Saturday morning, the 72-hour survival window, the period in which rescue teams give the highest probability of extracting living survivors from collapsed structures, was closing. Aid agencies universally recognize this threshold. The International Red Cross Regional Director for the Americas said, "People are still terrified to re-enter what were their homes." A UN rescue coordinator described the first 72 hours as the period in which every second matters. Those seconds have now passed. The science behind that 72-hour threshold is specific. In a structural collapse, people trapped in voids, the spaces created between fallen slabs, furniture, and walls, can survive for days if they have access to any moisture and are not crushed by secondary collapse. But Venezuela's coastal climate is punishing. Temperatures in La Guaira in late June reach 34 degrees Celsius in the afternoon. Dehydration accelerates. Internal injuries that were manageable at hour 1 become fatal by hour 60. The stench that rescue workers described spreading through the coastal communities by Saturday afternoon was not coming from debris. It was coming from the spaces between the slabs. Yonahi Regalado had been calling out the names of her sister and her 1-year-old nephew since 1 a.m. the morning after the earthquake. She called their names across open rubble for 27 hours before the first international rescue teams arrived alongside her. When the Mexican military team arrived, shouting into the debris in Spanish, asking for any sound, any movement, she stood beside them and listened. The silence that answered was the kind that fills the gap between 1,430 and 68,900. But 430 aftershocks have made even the closing of that window more complicated. On Friday, June 26th, 2 days after the main event, a magnitude 4.7 aftershock struck. It was strong enough to collapse the bridge connecting the parish of Caraballeda to the rest of La Guaira, severing road access to one of the hardest-hit areas and disrupting the flow of rescue teams into the zone. On Saturday, a magnitude 4.8 event struck off Aragua State. In a disaster zone where structures are already compromised, a 4.7 aftershock is not an inconvenience. It is a second catastrophe inside the first one. The response has been fractured. Venezuela's government deployed 14,000 military and police personnel to La Guaira and simultaneously restricted civilian access, requiring special permits to enter the disaster zone. The restrictions were announced as aimed at clearing roads for ambulances. Survivors described a different reality. "They came to eat arepas and take pictures," said one resident in Caraballeda, referring to government officials who photographed themselves at collapse sites and then left without helping. A minute later, another resident tried to physically stop a government excavator from leaving an active search site. International teams arrived, more than 1,600 rescue personnel from 30 countries, including teams from Mexico, the United States, El Salvador, Colombia, France, and Spain. The U.S. deployed 80-person teams from Los Angeles and Fairfax County, activated within 2 hours of the disaster. Miami-Dade teams were federalized and deployed. The first time in over a decade, the State Department authorized more than its standard 2 USAR units. The USS Fort Lauderdale, an amphibious Navy vessel, positioned off Venezuela's coast to receive airlifted survivors requiring medical care. One runway at Simón Bolívar International Airport became operational Saturday morning, easing a critical bottleneck. The airport had been closed since the earthquake, the main international gateway to the country, damaged by the same shaking that brought down the buildings around it. In the rubble of a public housing tower in La Guaira, rescuers pulled an older man out on Saturday afternoon. He was disoriented. He begged a nurse for water. When they placed him in a pickup truck, he began screaming, not from pain, but from the realization that he was leaving the site without his family. My family, my family. They had to physically restrain him. He did not know whether they were among the 68,900 or among the 1,430. Nobody did. Here is the number that will define this disaster going forward: $4.7 to $8.7 billion. That is the UN Development Program's estimate of direct physical damage from the twin earthquakes, roughly 6% of Venezuela's entire gross domestic product, in a country that has already spent a decade in economic crisis. This estimate covers housing and physical structures only. It does not include infrastructure loss, which includes the airport, the Caraballeda Bridge, the port at La Guaira, the road corridors connecting the capital to the coast. It does not include the long-term economic disruption of losing Venezuela's primary seaport and its main international airport simultaneously. It does not account for the displacement of up to 6.76 million people, or the reconstruction of 58,870 damaged or destroyed buildings in a country with a healthcare system described by experts as having been neglected for decades. That healthcare system is now the quiet second crisis inside the first. Hospitals across La Guaira and Caracas were evacuated during the earthquake. Patients, some in intensive care, some post-surgical were moved into parking lots and sidewalks. Footage showed people on gurneys in open air, IV lines still attached under the Venezuelan sun. Staff at the Hospital de Clínicas in Caracas were asked to double their night shifts immediately after the earthquake. Venezuela has faced chronic shortages of medical supplies, surgical equipment, and basic pharmaceuticals for years before June 24th. The earthquake did not create those shortages, it simply removed the buildings that were managing them. The U.S. committed $150 million in immediate aid. A second package of more than $100 million was being prepared as of Saturday. Mobile hospitals were being airlifted in. Starlink agreed to provide free emergency satellite internet for rescue coordination, but every hour that passes without a confirmed name from the 68,900 list is an hour in which a family somewhere in Caracas, in Miami, in Bogota, in Madrid, is still waiting for a phone to ring. The satellite image cannot tell you whether the person who used to live in that building is among the 68,900 or among the 1,430. What it can tell you is that the building is gone, and that there are 58,869 more buildings just like it. The rescue window has closed, the recovery has not yet begun. And somewhere in the gap between those two realities, tens of thousands of families are still waiting for an answer that may never come through official channels, or may only come when the rubble is finally cleared, weeks or months from now, and the satellite images are compared to what was found underneath. That is the story the news cycle moved past on Saturday morning. The confirmed numbers looked clean enough to move on. 1,430 dead, a number that fits in a headline. 68,900 missing does not fit in a headline. It barely fits in the mind, but it is the number that matters. Subscribe to Seismic Alert. We will stay until we have answers.